Clara Monroe had always known the land would shape her fate. But nothing in her past could have prepared her for the day the wind changed and the world she knew began to unravel. Her existence in the Hawk's Rest Valley, a remote and often unforgiving pocket of the Montana Territory, was a quiet testament to her own resilience. Life was measured by the rhythm of the seasons, the mending of fences, and the soft, steady breathing of her daughter, Abigail, from the small adjoining room of their cabin. The vastness of the landscape, with its jagged peaks scraping against an endless sky, served as a constant reminder of her own smallness, her own solitude. 2 years had passed since a harsh winter had claimed her husband, leaving Clara to carve out a life for herself and Abby from the stubborn soil, their homestead a fortress built of grit and a mother's unyielding love. This peace, however, was as delicate as the frost that painted the window panes in the morning. It was a peace that could be undone by a sudden illness, a drought, or the profound silence that signaled something was amiss. On this particular morning, the silence was a heavy, unnerving blanket. Patch, Abby's stout little pony, was not in his paddock. His absence was a stark anomaly, a disruption to the morning's familiar cadence. A knot of pure dread tightened in Clara's stomach as she pulled on her worn leather gloves. The biting cold of the early spring air a sharp contrast to the heat of her rising panic. "Mama, where did Patch go?" Abby's voice, small and trembling with nascent fear, came from the cabin doorway. She stood there, a small, bundled figure, her eyes scanning the empty enclosure with a look of dawning horror. Clara forced a calm she did not feel, her own gaze sweeping the property line, instantly finding what she was looking for. The small, distinct hoofprints were a clear trail in the damp earth, leading away from the barn, past the sagging fence, and straight towards the one place forbidden to them, Cain's Canyon. A cold dread, more piercing than the wind, settled deep into Clara's bones. Cain's Canyon wasn't merely a feature of the landscape, it was a local legend, a place of ill repute. It was a deep, violent gash in the earth, named for Bartholomew Cain, the ruthless rancher whose vast lands bordered the canyon and whose reputation was as dark and treacherous as the chasm itself. It was said to be a place of shadows and sudden drops, where livestock and prospectors alike had vanished without a trace. It was a place where the world felt raw and unfinished, and now it had seemingly swallowed her daughter's pony. "Stay inside, Abby," Clara said, her voice sharp with an authority that left no room for argument. "Lock the door, and do not open it for anyone." "Do you understand me, Abby?" Her face pale with fear, gave a single, jerky nod and disappeared back inside as the bolt slid home. Clara grabbed a coil of heavy rope from the barn and set off, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. The descent into the canyon was a slow, deliberate journey into another world. The cheerful birdsong of the valley faded, replaced by an oppressive silence broken only by the whisper of the wind through the sparse, hardy pines. The path narrowed, the rock walls rising on either side like silent, watching giants. Every step was a calculated risk on the loose shale that littered the trail. Clara moved with a grim focus, her eyes locked on Patch's tracks, a fragile thread leading her deeper into the gloom. She called out his name, but the sound was thin and small, devoured by the immense, echoing space around her. The air grew colder, carrying the scent of damp earth and something else. Something metallic and unsettling that she couldn't quite place. She found him standing near a cluster of junipers, his head bowed, his shaggy coat blending into the shadows. He was nickering softly, a low, anxious sound directed at something lying on the ground nearby. At first, Clara's mind registered only a dark, crumpled shape. Then she saw the horse. It was a magnificent black stallion, or had been. Now it lay on its side, its legs tangled at an unnatural angle, its lifeblood forming a dark, still pool in the dirt. A wave of sickness rose in Clara's throat. This was no accident. This was the work of men. Her eyes snapped back to the other shape, and her breath caught. It was a man, lying face down, one arm thrown out as if in a final. Desperate plea. A primal instinct screamed at her to turn back, to grab the pony and flee. But she was frozen, her gaze drawn to the scene of brutal violence. The dirt around the man was torn and scuffed, clear evidence of a fierce struggle. A spent shell casing glinted dully near his outstretched hand, moving as if in a dream. She crept closer, her hand clutching the heavy rope at her waist. She knelt, her knees protesting on the cold. Hard ground, and with a strength born of pure adrenaline. She gently rolled him onto his back. His face was a mask of blood and grime, but beneath it, she could see the strong lines of a jaw and the dark stubble of a man who had been riding hard for days. A deep gash on his forehead was caked with drying blood, but it was the wound on his shoulder that made her gasp. It was a bullet hole, dark and ugly against the pale skin of his torn shirt. He was still breathing, but the breaths were shallow, almost imperceptible. She pressed her trembling fingers to his neck and found a pulse. A faint, thready flutter against her cold fingertips. He was alive, but only just, for a long, agonizing moment. Clara was trapped in a whirlwind of indecision. Logic and fear warred with a deep-seated sense of duty. The logic was simple and brutal. This man was a magnet for the violence that had left him here. Whoever shot him could still be in the canyon, or they could come back to finish the job. To help him would be to drag that violence across her threshold, to expose Abby to a world of danger she had fought so hard to keep at bay. The smart choice, the survivor's choice, was to take Patch and walk away, erase this scene from her memory, retreat to her cabin, and pray that the darkness of Cain's Canyon never found her. Yet, she could not move. She looked at his still face, stripped of all aggression, and saw only a human being on the brink of death. She thought of her husband, Thomas, and the helpless rage she had felt watching him slip away, praying for a help that never came. To leave this man to the mercy of the elements would be a betrayal of that memory. It would be an act of coldness she wasn't sure she could live with. What kind of a world was she building for Abby if she taught her that survival meant sacrificing your own humanity? The fragile peace she had cherished was already an illusion, broken the moment she found him. The only real choice left was not whether to engage with this new, dangerous world, but how. The decision settled not in her mind, but in her soul. It was a heavy, somber acceptance. This stranger would not die in this canyon. Not today. The sheer impossibility of the task was staggering. He was a solidly built man, a dead weight of muscle and bone. And she was alone. But as she looked from his still form to the small, sturdy frame of the pony, a flicker of that same stubborn will that had seen her through 2 lonely winters ignited within her. She had battled the land, and she had won. She would battle this too. Her first act was to calm Patch, whose wide, frightened eyes were still fixed on the scene. With a soft voice and a steady hand, she led him to the man's side, working quickly. She tore a long strip from the dead stallion's saddle blanket, folding it into a thick pad and pressing it firmly against the bleeding shoulder wound. Next came the immense challenge of moving him. She looped her heavy rope under his arms and around his chest, fashioning a crude but strong harness. The other end she tied securely to Patch's saddle horn, whispering words of encouragement to the trembling pony. The ascent from the canyon was a grueling, torturous ordeal. It was a primal struggle against the unyielding forces of gravity and inertia. Clara positioned herself at the front, digging her heels into the loose shale, her muscles screaming in protest as she pulled in unison with the pony. The man's body scraped and bumped against the rocks, and a low, pained groan escaped his lips. A sound that sent a fresh jolt of fear and urgency through her. Sweat streamed into her eyes, stinging and blurring her vision. Her breath came in raw. Desperate sobs. This was the immediate cost of her compassion, paid for with every ounce of her strength, with each hard-won foot of ground. She was not just hauling a dying man toward safety, she was pulling herself, and her daughter, into a future that was now dangerously, terrifyingly unknown. The agonizing journey from the canyon floor ended at the threshold of her own home. But the struggle was far from over. Getting the stranger's inert form inside the cabin was a final, brutal test of Clara's endurance. He was a dead weight, a mountain of a man whose unconsciousness seemed to make him heavier, more cumbersome. With a series of grunts and heaving lunges, she managed to drag him across the wooden floorboards, leaving a smear of dirt and blood in his wake. The spare cot in the corner, the one that had belonged to her husband, sagged under his weight for a long moment. Clara could only stand there, her body trembling with exhaustion, her hands raw and aching, listening to the ragged sound of her own breathing mingle with his. The door was closed, the lock bolted, but she knew with a chilling certainty that the danger she had tried so hard to keep at bay was now sleeping under her roof. The first 2 days were a descent into a feverish hell. The bullet wound in his shoulder, crudely bandaged and exposed to the elements for hours, had become infected. A deep, dangerous heat radiated from his body, and his skin was dry and flushed. He tossed and turned on the narrow cot, lost in a delirious landscape of his own, in the long, quiet hours of the night, with Abby sleeping peacefully in her room. Clara sat by his side, a silent sentinel. She bathed his forehead with cool water and forced sips of a bitter willow bark tea between his cracked lips. Her mind falling back on the hard-learned lessons from Thomas's final days. The experience, once a source of pure grief, now became a well of practical knowledge. She cleaned the wound with a fierce, focused determination, her stomach churning at the sight but her hands steady. In his delirium, fragments of his story surfaced like wreckage from a sunken ship. He muttered names she didn't know, cursed the name Cain with a venom that made her blood run cold, and spoke of horses, not just any horses, but stallions, with a tone of reverence and profound loss. He spoke of water, of a spring. His words disjointed and feverish, but painting a confusing picture of a conflict she could not yet comprehend. She listened, piecing together the broken shards of his narrative, her fear growing with every garbled word. This was no simple robbery. This was something deeper, something tied to the land itself, and to the ruthless man for whom the nearby canyon was named. Abby, with the boundless curiosity of a child, was both a comfort and a constant source of anxiety. She would stand in the doorway, her small face a mask of concern and intrigue. "Is the man sleeping? Mama," she would whisper. "Is he going to wake up?" Clara would reassure her with a calm she didn't feel, gently steering her away, trying to shield her from the grim reality of the situation. Yet, it was Abby who forged the first true connection. On the third day, the fever finally broke. The man's eyes fluttered open, no longer clouded with delirium, but clear and filled with a raw, disoriented confusion. He tried to push himself up, only to fall back with a sharp gasp of pain, his face pale and slick with sweat. Before Clara could move, Abby had slipped past her. She carried a tin cup of water in both hands, holding it out to the stranger. "You're awake," she said, her voice clear and without a trace of fear. "Mama says water makes you strong." For a moment, the man just stared, first at the child, then at the cup, and finally at Clara, who stood frozen by the hearth. A complex storm of emotions moved across his features: confusion, pain, and then something else. Something that looked like profound, crushing shame. He, a man of strength and action, was being offered aid by a small child. A guest in a home he had no right to be in. Slowly, he reached out with his good arm, his hand trembling as he accepted the cup. His gaze met Clara's over Abby's head, and in that silent, shared look, a fragile, unspoken truce was formed. His name, she learned, was Isaac Ford? He spoke in a low, rough voice, the words coming slowly as if each one was a physical effort. Over the course of the next day, as his strength began to seep back into him, he told her the rest of the story. He was the owner of the Ford Creek Ranch, a large spread of land on the other side of the valley. But his family had fallen on hard times, and he was mired in debt. The prize stallions, his last remaining asset of real value, were his only hope. He was driving them to a sale in another territory, a sale that would have saved his ranch when he was ambushed. "It wasn't a random attack," he rasped, his eyes dark with conviction. "They didn't just want the horses, they wanted me dead." He confirmed her deepest fears, giving a name to the phantom that haunted his fever dreams: Bartholomew Kane. "Kane has wanted my land for years," Isaac explained, his jaw tight with anger. "Not for the grazing, but for the water. I have the only year-round spring in this part of the valley. With it, he could double his herd and control everything from here to the mountains." He had been left for dead, his legacy stolen, his future erased by a rival's greed. As he spoke, Clara felt a strange mixture of pity and terror. His story made him real. Not just a stranger, but a man who had been deeply wronged. Yet, his reality was now her own. His enemy was now her problem. A shadow that loomed not just over him, but over her and Abby as well. By the fifth day, Isaac was able to sit up on his own, though the effort left him drained and pale. But Clara's supplies were running dangerously low. The last of her clean linen had been used for bandages, and the herbs she used to keep infection at bay were gone. She needed more, and the only place to get them was the mercantile at the edge of the nearest settlement, a place she actively avoided. The thought of the journey filled her with a new kind of dread, one that had nothing to do with treacherous canyons. It was the fear of prying eyes and wagging tongues. She rode out the next morning, leaving Isaac with a stern warning to stay inside and out of sight. The mercantile was a small, cluttered building that smelled of dust, leather, and coffee. Mr. Abernathy, the proprietor, was a man whose curiosity was as vast as the Montana sky. He watched her with beady eyes as she gathered her items: linen cloth, carbolic soap, and a small pouch of yarrow. "Seems like you're preparing for some serious mending." "Clara," he said, his voice laced with insinuation as he rang up her purchases. "Not planning on doing any surgery, are you?" Clara felt a flush of heat rise to her cheeks, but kept her expression neutral. "Just stocking up for the season. Mr. Abernathy? You know how it is. Better to have it and not need it." Her heart hammered in her chest as she felt the weight of his gaze, and the stares of two other ranchers who had stopped their conversation to listen. The air in the small store was thick with unspoken questions. A widow, living alone so far out. Buying these kinds of supplies, it was a deviation from the norm, a disruption to the predictable patterns of the valley. And it would be noted, discussed, and dissected over whiskeys and checkerboards for days to come. The ride home was tense, the precious supplies tucked safely in her saddlebag. She felt like a fugitive, her guilt and fear a palpable presence riding alongside her. When she returned to the cabin, she found Isaac asleep on the cot, his face calmer and more peaceful than she had yet seen it. Abby was sitting on the floor nearby, quietly drawing on a piece of slate, a self-appointed guardian. As Clara looked at the scene, the sleeping man who was the source of her newfound terror and the innocent child he had unknowingly endangered, she felt the true weight of her situation settle upon her. The fortress she had built to protect her family now had a guest, and outside its walls. The world had begun to watch, and to whisper. The danger was no longer just a shadow in a distant canyon. It was a suspicion taking root in the hearts of her neighbors. The weeks that followed settled into a quiet, deceptive rhythm, masking the tension that simmered just beneath the surface. Time began to weave a fragile tapestry of normalcy over the violent events that had brought Isaac Ford into their lives. The raw, desperate urgency of his initial recovery gave way to a slow, steady convalescence. The deep lines of pain around his eyes softened, and the gauntness in his cheeks was replaced by the returning strength of a man accustomed to hard, physical labor. He was no longer just a patient, a helpless body confined to a cot. He became a presence, a quiet force that began to reshape the daily life of the small homestead. His strength returned in increments, measured first by his ability to walk the length of the cabin without wavering, then by the simple act of chopping firewood. The rhythmic thud of the axe a new and strangely comforting sound against the vast silence of the valley. Clara watched him, her heart a battlefield of conflicting emotions. She saw him expertly reset the hinge on a stubborn barn door that had plagued her for months. His movements economical and sure. She saw him brace a sagging fence post with a skill that spoke of a lifetime of such work. With each task he completed, he was inadvertently rebuilding not just the physical structures of her farm, but also a sense of security she hadn't realized she had so desperately missed. It was a treacherous feeling, this nascent sense of safety, because she knew its source was also the very source of their peril. This internal war raged most fiercely when she watched him with Abby. Isaac possessed a natural, gentle authority with the child that was both beautiful and heartbreaking to witness. He spent an afternoon teaching her not just how to sit on Patch's back, but how to understand the pony, how to read the flick of its ears and the twitch of its muscles. "You don't command a horse with force." "Abby," he told her, his voice low and patient as he adjusted the reins in her small hands. "You earn its trust. You let it know you're steady, that you won't lead it into harm." He spoke of horses with a deep, abiding love, and in his words, Clara could hear the echo of the world he had lost the prize stallions, the sprawling ranch, the life that had been stolen from him in a blaze of greed and violence, watching them from the porch. Clara felt a powerful ache in her chest, the sight of Isaac lifting Abby onto the pony's back, his large, capable hands so gentle, created a perfect portrait of a family, a father and a daughter silhouetted against the setting sun. It was a vision of a life she had thought was forever gone, a life she had stopped allowing herself to even dream of. The feeling was so potent, so filled with a dangerous hope, that it terrified her. She was growing to care for this man, to rely on his presence, and this attachment made the threat he carried with him all the more real. The more he became a part of their small world, the more they had to lose when his past inevitably came to claim him. Isaac, for his part, was fighting a different battle. The physical wounds were healing, but the wounds to his pride and his sense of self were deeper. Each day he spent on Clara's small homestead was a day he was not hunting the men who had wronged him. The desire for revenge was a hot, bitter coal in his gut, a constant urge to ride out and reclaim what was his. Yet, every time he looked at Clara, her quiet strength a constant, humbling presence, or saw Abby's trusting, innocent face, the fire of his vengeance was banked by a profound sense of responsibility. These two, a lonely woman and a fatherless child, had saved his life. He owed them a debt he could never fully repay, and the first payment on that debt was to protect them, even from himself. To ride out for revenge would be to abandon them. And worse, to potentially lead Cain's men right back to their door. The fragile peace was shattered on a cool, clear afternoon, seeking to test the limits of his recovering shoulder. Isaac had taken to walking the far perimeter of the property, his long strides eating up the familiar terrain. Near a ridge that overlooked the valley, something caught his eye. It was out of place. A small, jarring detail in the landscape he was beginning to know so well. Half hidden in the tall grass was a single, freshly discarded cigarette, its end still slightly damp. He knelt, his jaw tightening. He didn't smoke, and Clara certainly didn't. This was recent, a sign that someone had stood on this very ridge, watching the cabin, watching them. The silence of the valley suddenly felt different, no longer peaceful, but charged with a hidden, malevolent attention. The confirmation came 2 days later. Isaac was on the same ridge at dusk, his gaze sweeping the darkening hills. When he saw it, it was a flicker of movement, a silhouette against the vibrant colors of the sunset. A lone rider sat on horseback on a distant bluff, as still as a statue. The distance was too great to make out features, but there was an unmistakable posture to the man, a predatory stillness that sent a chill down Isaac's spine. The rider remained for a long, deliberate minute, a clear and undeniable statement of presence, before turning his horse and melting back into the shadows of the hills. Isaac didn't need to see his face. He knew, with a certainty that settled like a stone in his stomach, that it was Finn. Kane's most trusted and ruthless enforcer. He returned to the cabin as darkness fell, his face a grim, unreadable mask. The tentative domesticity of the evening, the smell of stew simmering on the stove. Abby humming quietly as she played by the fire felt like a scene from a life that was no longer theirs. Clara saw the look on his face and her heart stopped. The question she had been dreading for weeks was in her eyes before she could even speak it. Isaac didn't waste words. He stood before the hearth, the firelight casting long, dancing shadows across the room, and the quiet rhythm of their life came to a halt. "He knows," Isaac said, his voice low and heavy with a terrible finality. "Kane knows I'm alive. One of his men was on the ridge at sundown, watching us." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and suffocating. This was the moment the fragile tapestry of their new life finally tore. The danger was no longer a story, a memory of a past event. It was here. It was now. It was a shadow lingering on their doorstep, patiently waiting for the right moment to strike. The 2 days that followed Isaac's revelation were a silent, suffocating exercise in waiting. The cozy warmth of the cabin evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp-edged tension that permeated every corner. The air itself felt thin, charged with a dreadful anticipation. They moved through their chores with a mechanical precision, the familiar routines now feeling like a fragile charade against the impending chaos. Every unexpected sound, the distant cry of a hawk, the sudden clatter of a pan, the sigh of the wind caused them both to freeze, their eyes meeting in a shared, unspoken question. Is it time beneath the surface of this shared silence? A frantic, unspoken dialogue was taking place through their actions, a grim preparation for a battle neither of them had chosen but both knew they must face. Isaac, driven by a restless energy, became a surveyor of their small fortress. He examined every plank of the cabin walls, every latch on the windows, assessing their strengths and weaknesses with a practiced, analytical eye. He took down the rifle her husband had kept mounted over the fireplace, its polished walnut stock and cold steel barrel feeling both alien and terrifyingly necessary in Clara's hands. He showed her how to check the chamber, how to work the bolt, his voice low and steady, a stark contrast to the tremor she felt in her own fingers. Their ammunition was pitifully scarce, a handful of cartridges for his pistol, slightly more for the rifle. Each bullet was a precious, finite resource, a last line of defense against the coming tide. He stood for a long time by the hearth, his hand resting on the loose floorboards Clara had pointed out, a grim smile touching his lips. It was a weakness, Yes, but a weakness they could perhaps turn into a weapon. Clara, in turn, found herself plunged into a maelstrom of internal conflict as she watched Isaac move about her home. His presence now one of a protector rather than a patient. Her heart felt as if it were being torn in two. A part of her, a part she had thought long buried with Thomas, felt a profound and treacherous sense of relief. There was a man in the house again, a strong, capable man standing between her and the dangers of the world. But this feeling was immediately strangled by a wave of pure terror. This man was the danger. His very presence had painted a target on their backs. This terrifying paradox left her feeling breathless. Her growing affection for him was a vulnerability she could not afford, a weakness that felt more dangerous than any of Cain's men, for it gave her so much more to lose. The sky began its ominous transformation on the afternoon of the second day. The crisp, brilliant blue of the Montana sky dissolved into a bruised, sullen gray. Clouds, heavy and dark as charcoal smudges, gathered along the mountain peaks, creeping down into the valley with a slow, deliberate menace. The air grew thick and still, charged with the smell of ozone and damp earth. Isaac stood on the porch, his face turned toward the advancing weather front. And a final, unspoken confirmation passed between him and Clara. A storm. A wailed, untamed Montana storm. The kind that could provide perfect cover for men who dealt in darkness and violence. "Tonight," he said. His voice barely a whisper against the rising wind, and the single word sealed their fate. As the first heavy drops of rain began to strike the roof like scattered pebbles, the cabin transformed. The waiting was over. There was no room for fear now, only for cold. Calculated action. They dragged the heavy oaken dining table, a piece Clara had cherished for its memories of family meals, and barricaded the front door. "The back window," Clara said, her voice sharp and clear. "It's the weakest point." Isaac nodded, and together they nailed a thick plank across it. Every hammer blow was a punctuation mark in their silent prayer for survival. The most agonizing task was hiding Abby. Clara knelt before her daughter in the dim light, her heart aching with a pain that was almost physical. She explained the hiding game again, her voice a low, steady murmur, trying to project a calm that was the greatest lie she had ever told. She gave Abby her own mother's silver locket to hold. "You hold on to this for me," she whispered, her throat tight. "And you stay absolutely silent. My love, be as quiet as a field mouse. Can you do that for Mama?" Seeing the terrified trust in Abby's wide eyes as she nodded, Clara felt her resolve harden into something unbreakable. She tucked her into the small, dark root cellar beneath the floor, a space filled with the earthy smell of potatoes and winter storage, and gently closed the trapdoor over her head. The storm broke with a primal, unrestrained fury. Rain lashed against the cabin in horizontal sheets, and the wind shrieked like a banshee. Thunder exploded overhead, a deafening, rolling cannonade that vibrated through the floorboards and shook the very soul. Inside, there was only the flickering, dancing light of a single lantern and the taut, electric silence of two people waiting for the world to end. Isaac was a statue in the shadows by the main door, pistol in hand. Clara stood near the fireplace, the heavy rifle feeling like an extension of her own rigid arms. An hour passed, then another. Then, through the symphony of the storm, a sound that was jarringly out of place, the soft, wet scrape of a boot on the porch's wooden planks. The main door groaned as a heavy shoulder slammed against it. The wooden bar Isaac had wedged in place bowed but held. A string of muffled curses was swept away by the wind. A moment later, a dark shape flickered past the west window. Isaac held up a hand, a silent command for Clara to hold her position. The attack shifted. A loud thud came from the back of the cabin, followed by the sharp crack of splintering wood as the reinforced window finally began to give way. It was then that Clara moved. All her fear and anxiety crystallized into a single point of fierce, protective rage. She snatched the heavy iron kettle of boiling water from the stove, moved to the back wall, and without hesitation, hurled its scalding contents through the broken window frame. A raw, piercing scream tore through the night, a sound of pure agony that was almost immediately swallowed by a deafening clap of thunder. The front door burst inward, the barricade shattering under the weight of a coordinated, brutal assault. 3 men, not 2, spilled into the room, their forms menacing silhouettes against the storm-lit doorway. One lunged for Clara, while the other 2 moved on Isaac. At that moment, Clara made another split-second decision, with a desperate cry. She swung the heavy iron skillet from its hook and flung it at the lantern. The glass shattered, and the room was plunged into a disorienting, almost absolute darkness, broken only by the strobing, epileptic flashes of lightning. The darkness was their only true ally. The intruders were blind, but Clara knew the geography of this room by heart. The cabin became a whirlwind of desperate, close-quarters combat. A flash of lightning revealed a horrifying tableau, Isaac grappling with one man. The report of his pistol deafeningly loud as he fired, and the first intruder falling. The third man, momentarily confused by the darkness, turned on Clara. She sidestepped him, her hand finding the cold, familiar handle of the fireplace poker. She swung it wildly, connecting with a sickening thud. The man grunted and stumbled back, giving Isaac the opening to deal with his own opponent. But in the chaos, Finn, the enforcer, the leader, had finally entered the fray. He ignored Clara and charged straight for Isaac. His face a mask of pure fury. He was bigger, stronger, and uninjured. He drove Isaac back against the wall, the impact knocking the wind from his lungs. The pistol clattered to the floor, lost somewhere in the darkness. Finn's powerful hands found Isaac's throat, squeezing with methodical, murderous pressure. Isaac clawed at the man's wrist, his feet scrambling for purchase. But his vision began to swim, black spots dancing before his eyes. His recovering shoulder screamed in protest, a fire of pure agony. He was losing. Clara, across the room, saw the life and death struggle in another brilliant flash of lightning. There was no time to think, only to act. Her eyes darted around the wrecked room and fell upon the coil of rope by the door, the same rope she had used to save him. It was a lifeline then, and it would be a lifeline now. Moving with the silent, deadly grace of a cornered animal, she snatched one end of it, while Finn focused all his brutal strength on ending Isaac. She crept through the shadows, a phantom in her own home, as Finn leaned in, putting his full weight into the final, killing pressure. Clara whipped the rope forward, looping it expertly around his ankles. She planted her feet, and with a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength that came from the deepest well of her being, she yanked the rope with everything she had. Finn, caught completely by surprise, his center of gravity compromised, let out a strangled grunt as his legs were violently swept from under him. He crashed backward to the floor with the force of a felled tree, his grip on Isaac's throat finally broken. Isaac collapsed against the wall, gasping, sucking in ragged, life-giving breaths. The fall had stunned Finn for only a second, but a second was all Isaac needed. With a guttural roar, a sound of pure, primal survival, he launched himself onto the fallen man. The fight that followed was not one of skill, but of sheer, unadorned will. When it was over, a profound silence descended upon the room, a silence that felt deeper and more absolute than the raging storm outside. It was the silence of the aftermath, The silence of survival. In the darkness, illuminated only by the fading flashes of lightning, Clara saw Isaac rise, his chest heaving. Their eyes met across the wreckage of her home, and in that shared glance, a new understanding was forged. They were not rescuer and victim. They were partners. They were survivors. The silence that descended upon the cabin in the wake of the battle was more profound than any sound. It was a heavy, ringing quiet, thick with the scent of rain-soaked wood, gunpowder, and the metallic tang of shed blood. Outside, the storm's fury was spent, the thunder fading into a distant, grumbling echo, the rain softening to a gentle, cleansing whisper. For a long moment, Isaac and Clara simply stood amidst the wreckage of her home, their chests heaving, their bodies trembling with the violent aftermath of adrenaline. They were bruised, exhausted, and splattered with the grim evidence of the fight. But they were alive, in the flickering, dying light of the fire. Their eyes met, and in that shared gaze was a raw, unfiltered understanding that transcended words. They were no longer just a woman and a stranger. They were two soldiers who had survived the same war. Clara's first coherent thought was of Abby. Pushing herself away from the wall, her legs unsteady, she moved to the trapdoor, her hands fumbling with the latch. She lifted it, revealing the small, dark space below. "Abby," she called, her voice a ragged whisper. "It's all right now, sweetheart. You can come out. The game is over." A small, tear-streaked face peered up from the darkness, her daughter's eyes wide with a terror that tore at Clara's heart. She reached down and lifted Abby into her arms, holding her tight against her chest, burying her face in her daughter's hair and inhaling the familiar, innocent scent of her. Abby clung to her, her small body trembling uncontrollably. And in that moment, Clara knew that the true cost of the night's violence would be measured in the slow, patient healing of her child's fear. An hour later, as the first pale gray light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, another sound reached them, the steady, rhythmic beat of approaching horses. Isaac, who had finished binding the hands and feet of Finn and the other unconscious attacker, moved to the doorway, his body tensing once more. But it was not the return of the enemy. A lone rider, followed by a deputy, emerged from the misty, rain-soaked landscape. It was Sheriff Brody, his face set in a grim, weary expression. A neighbor, miles down the valley, had been woken by the sound of gunfire carried on the storm and had ridden for help at first light. The law had finally arrived, not as saviors, but as witnesses to the aftermath. Sheriff Brody dismounted, his eyes taking in the scene with a practiced, dispassionate gaze, the battered cabin door, the body of the third man lying near the porch, and the two battered but living figures of Isaac and Clara. He remembered the gossip from the mercantile, the whispers about the widow and the stranger. His initial posture was one of deep skepticism, the look of a man expecting to unravel a messy, domestic dispute. But as he stepped inside the cabin, the scene told a different story. He saw the overturned furniture, the shattered lantern, the blood on the floor, and the two heavily armed intruders, now bound and subdued. He listened without interruption as Isaac gave a calm, factual account of the night, his voice devoid of bravado or exaggeration. As Isaac spoke, Sheriff Brody's demeanor slowly changed. The suspicion in his eyes was replaced by a grudging respect. He looked from the still healing wound on Isaac's shoulder to the fierce, protective set of Clara's jaw, and then to the terrified child clinging to her mother's skirts. He was a man who understood the harsh realities of this land, and he recognized the look of people who had been pushed to the absolute limit and had refused to break. "You did what you had to do," Brody said, his voice a low grumble of finality. He and his deputy hauled the unconscious forms of Finn and his cohort away. leaving a quiet promise to send word about Bartholomew Kane. The law had come and gone, and in its wake, an exhausted, profound peace began to settle over the homestead. The dawn that broke was stunningly beautiful. The sky washed clean by the storm, the air crisp and smelling of pine and wet earth. But the morning light was merciless, revealing the full extent of the devastation. The cabin was a wreck, the yard a trampled mess of mud and splintered wood. It was a physical manifestation of their shattered peace. For a moment, the task of rebuilding seemed insurmountable. Yet, as they stood together on the porch, watching the sun climb over the mountains, they found a shared, unspoken resolve. They had defended this place. Now they would reclaim it. The days that followed were filled with the therapeutic rhythm of hard, physical work. There was little talk between them. Words felt inadequate, clumsy things in the face of what they had shared. Instead, they communicated through the silent language of shared labor. When Isaac began the arduous task of rebuilding the shattered doorframe, Clara was there, handing him the tools before he even had to ask. When she worked to scrub the bloodstains from the floorboards, a task that made her stomach clench with the memory of the fight, he would quietly begin mending the broken chairs. His steady, methodical work a comforting presence in the room. They moved in a seamless, intuitive rhythm, a partnership born not of romance or courtship, but of the deep, unshakable respect two survivors have for one another. Abby, too, began to heal. Her nightmares lessened, replaced by a fierce desire to help. She would follow them around the yard, carrying small pieces of wood or wiping down surfaces with a damp cloth. Her childish imitation of their labor a poignant symbol of their collective recovery. Her laughter, when it finally returned, felt like the sun breaking through the clouds. A sound that began to slowly, carefully, chase the lingering shadows from the corners of their home. One evening, after a long day of replacing the fence posts that had been trampled in the chaos, they sat together before the fire. The cabin was whole again, the scars of the battle hidden beneath fresh wood and careful repairs. Abby was asleep, the locket Clara had given her still clutched in her hand. The fire crackled, casting a warm, gentle glow on their weary faces. The silence between them was no longer tense or fraught with danger, but comfortable, imbued with a deep, shared understanding. Isaac stared into the flames, his face thoughtful. "When they took my horses," he began, his voice low and contemplative, "they took everything, not the land. I still have the deed to my ranch." He paused and turned to look at her, his eyes clear and direct, holding nothing back. "But the land is just dirt without the capital to work it. The stallions were my last hope. As it stands, Clara, I'm a man with nothing left but a piece of paper." He laid his vulnerability bare, offering it to her not as a plea for pity, but as a simple, unvarnished truth. He was confessing what he saw as his failure, his brokenness. Clara listened, her heart aching not with pity, but with a surge of profound admiration. She did not see a broken man before her. She saw a man who had lost everything and had still found the strength to fight for his life, and then for hers. She saw a survivor. "You're not a man with nothing, Isaac," she said softly. Her voice filled with a conviction that surprised them both. "You're the man who stood his ground. You're the man who came back from the dead and rebuilt a stranger's door." She reached out, her hand gently covering his where it rested on his knee. "Land and horses, they can be lost. What you have, what you did here, that can't be taken away." In that moment, by the quiet fire in the heart of the home they had defended together, the final walls between them crumbled. Their connection, born in violence and desperation, forged in shared labor and mutual respect, now settled into something deeper, something quieter. something true. They were no longer just survivors. They were partners. And they both knew, with a silent, unshakable certainty, that their future, whatever it may hold, was now a path they would walk together. Clara Monroe found herself marking the passage of time not by the calendar, but by the subtle shifts in the world around her. The brutal chill of spring had finally surrendered to the deep, benevolent warmth of a Montana summer. The valley, once a landscape of stark survival, was now draped in lush green, the air thick with the sweet scent of clover and wild roses. The days fell into a seamless, peaceful rhythm, a quiet melody composed of shared labor and easy, comfortable silences. The specter of violence had receded, leaving behind a profound quiet, yet a gentle, unspoken question about their future hung in the warm, hazy air. Isaac was no longer a patient, no longer a guest. He had become an integral part of the homestead's heartbeat. As steady and essential as the flow of the nearby creek, their life together felt both as solid as the mountains that cradled the valley and as ephemeral as the morning mist. And Clara often found herself holding her breath, terrified that the slightest disturbance might cause it all to vanish. The world beyond their secluded sanctuary finally reached them on a bright August afternoon. Not with a threat, but with the quiet finality of justice. Sheriff Brody's horse ambled into their yard, and the man who dismounted was not the skeptical lawman of months past, but a man whose face held the weary satisfaction of a long-finished job. He confirmed that Finn and the other surviving attacker, facing the grim reality of a hangman's noose, had given detailed confessions that laid bare the entirety of Bartholomew Kane's ruthless operations. A federal marshal is involved now, Brody explained. Accepting a cup of water from Clara. Kane's empire is built on stolen land and intimidation, with his own men testifying against him. It's all coming down. He won't be troubling the folks in this valley again. The shadow that had stretched all the way from Kane's Canyon to their doorstep was finally irrevocably gone. The news was a cleansing tide, washing away the last dregs of fear, but it also illuminated the crossroads at which they now stood. The path was clear for Isaac to reclaim his birthright. A few days later, he announced he was riding out, a journey he needed to make alone. He needed to stand on the soil of the Ford Creek Ranch, to look his past in the eye and decide if it still had a claim on his soul. The ride itself was a pilgrimage through memory. He passed landmarks that had charted the course of his entire life, each one stirring a ghost of the ambitious. Proud man he used to be, when he finally stood on the high ridge overlooking the vast, empty expanse of his ancestral land. He felt not a sense of homecoming, but a profound and hollow ache. The grand house was just a dusty shell. The fields were just empty land, he realized, with a clarity that was both painful and liberating. That a legacy is a heavy burden when there is no one to share it with. His life was no longer here. It was miles away, in a small, resilient cabin, with a woman whose quiet strength had rebuilt him from the inside out, and a child who had taught him the meaning of hope. He returned with a settled peace in his heart, a quiet certainty guiding his steps. But he rode into a new, silent crisis. Clara met him at the fence line, her face pale, a forced smile failing to mask the despair in her eyes. In her hand, she held a letter from a bank in Helena. It was a cold, impersonal document, its legal jargon a death sentence for the life she had fought so desperately to protect. The loans her husband had taken on years ago, loans she had been steadily paying down with every crop she sold, were being called in. The bank was foreclosing. The homestead, the fortress she had defended with her own blood and spirit, would be sold at auction at the end of the month. She had been so focused on the threat from Kane that she had never seen this danger coming. A danger that came not with guns, but with ink and paper. She looked at Isaac, the man she had grown to love, and saw only the final. Bitter irony, he was returning to her just as she was about to lose everything. "I imagine you've come to say your goodbyes," she said. Her voice a low, trembling whisper that she prayed did not betray the shattering of her heart. "Your land is waiting for you. I'm happy for you. Isaac." He looked at her, at the crumpled letter in her hand, and then into her eyes, and he saw the depth of her despair. He dismounted slowly and stood before her. "I sold it. Clara," he said, his voice gentle but firm. The words were so far from what she expected that she could only stare at him in stunned silence. "The Ford Creek Ranch. I signed the deed over this morning to a cattle company." But why, she finally managed to ask, her mind reeling. "Isaac, that was your home, your entire family's legacy. It was a legacy of lonely men in a big, empty house," he replied, his gaze never leaving hers. "My father, his father before him. It was land. Clara, but it was never truly a home. I found out what a home is right here. It's a place that feels empty when someone is gone. It's a place worth fighting for. It's a place where you are." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out 2 documents, their fresh ink a stark contrast to the weathered paper in her hand. The first was the deed to her own homestead. It was marked "paid in full." He had taken the substantial sum from the sale of his ancestral land and, through a lawyer in town, had bought her freedom, before she could even process the magnitude of his action. He handed her the second document. It was the deed to the small, uncultivated plot of land that bordered her own. "I figured a man can't ask a woman to leave the home she fought for," he said, a small, genuine smile finally reaching his eyes. "So I decided to build my home next to hers. I'm not asking you to come with me. Clara, I'm asking if I can stay, if you'll let me build a life with you. Right here." The tears that fell from Clara's eyes were not the hot tears of grief she had cried for her husband, nor the cold tears of fear she had shed during the storm. They were tears of a profound, soul-deep relief, a catharsis that washed away years of loneliness and struggle. She couldn't form words. Her answer was in the way she threw her arms around his neck, in the way she held on as if he were the only solid thing in a world that had finally stopped spinning. The following weekend, they took down the fence that stood between their 2 properties. They worked together, Isaac pulling the posts from the earth, Clara coiling the old wire, with Abby running between them. Her laughter a bright, happy melody. It was not the destruction of a boundary, but the creation of a single, unified space, a home. Their life was no longer defined by what they had endured or lost, but by what they were now building together. The final image of their story, the one that would settle into the memory of the valley, was not one of grandeur or wealth. It was a simple, perfect scene bathed in the golden light of a late summer evening. It was the sight of Isaac, his face filled with a gentle joy, teaching Abby how to plant a small vegetable garden in the very spot where the fence had once stood. It was the sight of Clara, standing on her porch, a quiet, peaceful smile on her face as she watched the 2 people who had become her world. They were not a dynasty. They were a family. They were 3 survivors who had found in each other a home far grander than any ranch. A love that had taken root in the hard-won soil and was, at long last, ready to grow